Hello, everyone. It's so nice to see you today. Um, if you're able to turn your camera on, we'd love to see you. If you can't, we completely understand. I want to welcome you all to Making Connections, a new monthly 4-part series on loneliness, co-hosted by Allison Gilbert and Reimagine. My name is Andy Engel, and I lead virtual public programs at Reimagine. Since this series is all about making connections, please tell us where you are zooming in from in the chat. We want to get that chat active. There'll be time for questions. So as you hear our speakers, if anything pops up, please use that chat to post your question and we will field that to them. A bit about Reimagine first. Reimagine is a nonprofit organization catalyzing a uniquely powerful community, people of different backgrounds, different ages, different races and faiths, people of no faith, all coming together to heal ourselves, our communities, and the world. We support each other in facing adversity, loss, and mortality, and we hope to transform life's biggest challenges into meaningful action and growth. Reimagine resources, support groups, events like this one today are free and accessible to the public. This is made possible by the support and generosity of participants like you. So for those who already made a tax-deductible donation to Reimagine when you registered, thank you so much. Your gift will immediately support our mission to help people of all walks of life transform adversity into action. Before we begin, I do want to share a few Zoom tips with you. You can view a live transcription of what's being said using the CC button at the bottom of the screen, and you can save the chat by clicking on the 3 dots in the chat box. Feel free to send me and Nicole, or Nicole, Nicole Tan, helping out on today's call. Thank you, Nicole. Please send us a note in the chat. If you're having any difficulty, we can try to help you. And I want to get right to this. I'm going to say a few words about Allison, and then she will introduce our guests. Allison Gilbert is a longtime Reimagine collaborator and host. She is the author and co-author of numerous books, including Listen World, How the Intrepid Elsie Robinson Became America's Most Read Woman, Past and Present, Keeping Memories of Loved Ones Alive, and Always Too Soon, Voices of Support for Those Who Have Lost Both Parents. And she is the co-author of Dr. Ruth Westheimer's forthcoming book, The Joy of Connections, 100 Ways to Beat Loneliness and Live a Happier and More Meaningful Life. You can follow Allison on Instagram, X, Facebook. She's everywhere as A. Gilbert Writer. And now to you, Allison.
Thank you so much, Andy and Nicole. It is my favorite time of the month. That means I get to be here with all of you. I love this series. It is really meaningful to me. And I've heard from so many of you that it's meaningful to you as well. So thank you. I'm going to say a few housekeeping pieces of information just to add to what Andy said, but different. I encourage you, if you are in a safe place and you feel comfortable, to turn on your camera. We are here to discuss loneliness and isolation. And one of the things that we can do to feel more connected is to see other humans, to make eye contact. And we can't do that if your camera is off. So if you feel comfortable, I invite you to turn on your camera. So this series has been meaningful to me because we are, of course, in an epidemic of loneliness. The first part of our 4-part series, we had the United States Surgeon General on. We had Dr. Ruth Westheimer on, and these are the 2 preeminent experts who have set the tone for the just huge but surmountable problem and challenge that we are facing today of people not feeling like they belong. The second series, the second portion of the series, we focused on grief and how those who are mourning the loss of a loved one can feel particularly alone. Today is such a different topic, and I'm a bit over my skis because this is not something that I have researched. And so I'm going to lean so heavily on these preeminent thought leaders who are going to be talking to us about nature, about eco-anxiety, about what's happening in our built environment that could be prohibiting us from forming connections, but also to be tweaked to fuel more connections. And with Pamela, if you guys have read the reviews of her book, which we are going to get to, it is just a jaw dropper. And I can't wait to dig into your work, Pamela Prickett. I am so excited that you and Isaias are both here. I want to start with Isaias, if you don't mind. And there is a online magazine called the Bones Fanzine. And you said something about parks, where kids go to play, where parents take them, that you feel is a kernel of some reason why some people might feel unintentionally othered. And here's what you said. There's no acknowledgement or space for people with disabilities or people with different identities, people of different types of skin color. People get so afraid of queerness, but it's not about saying everyone's gay or trans. It's about saying, how do we become happier as a society to nurture one another for the better? And that's where my work, meaning Isaias's work, comes in. I try to educate people through the queer lens of inclusivity. I have been a mom. I've taken my kids to playgrounds. I want to hear more from your perspective how that environment can be othering for some people, and maybe what we can do about it now that we know, now that you've helped us understand, Isaias. Over to you.
Yes, well, thank you so much again. And I'm super excited to be here with Pamela too. Of course, I'm also excited to read your book now. I think that the main thing that we have to talk about when we talk about nature and outdoors is who nature and outdoors has often been portrayed for. So if we look back at early US American environmental policy, it's talked about how a lot of philosophers from like John Muir to other ecologists and environmentalists describe nature as this very pristine, sacred landscape. However, when you look more into the writing, it's detailed and depicted indigenous people as savage, as dirty, as not natural. And so I think that it's important to understand that like our view today of modern environmentalism is heavily influenced by conservationists who have had views around racism and segregation and othering. And I think that while we understand that, you know, we have more equality in society today, it is simply untrue for many marginalized and people with different identities of being constantly questioned and interrogated in landscapes. I think that it's important for when we talk about, you know, our own urban spaces like parks that many of us go in, we think about accessibility, not just from a diversity standpoint, but the ability in which one can actually interact with those species. And I think it's important that when we're understanding and talking about how do we connect to life, how do we connect to nature, that we understand the perspectives of those of what they're doing that looks completely different from people who are either able-bodied, people who are straight, people who are trans. They have different perspectives. And I think that there's no such thing as natural in an unnatural world because nature does not grow in uniformity, it grows in diversity. And so I think the importance is that when we interact with communities and species even humans and non-human animals and organisms, is how do we show reverence for them? And that's something that goes back to early principles of our cultural foundations of which our societies have been formed in from different continents and different cultures.
To those of us, and I'm including myself in this group, who are coming to this conversation hungry for a more specific understanding of what you are seeing and what you are feeling and the problem at stake, you walk into a park, and what don't you see that you feel in a world that we can build better should be constructed? Help us understand with specificity what would be useful in this conversation.
Yeah, I think what we are missing today, and goes for younger generations, even myself, is the loss of ecological wealth. I think the first thing is that we see monocultural lawns, right? Everything seems very pristine, like the grass is cut. You don't see fungi, you don't see that much flora, you don't see that much other insect species around it. And so I think that's important for us to understand, is that while we see, you go to park, you probably see kids playing, which is so amazing and needs to continue to be met, is that we don't really see the times for reflection. When's the last time we've seen our families do sound bathing together to listen to the melodies of which the non-human animals are speaking to us? When is the last time that we've identified a plant? Why is it the fact that anything that is seen that we don't traditionally eat in our diets is seen as poisonous and dangerous, and we see it as a weed, right? And I use this metaphor of weed because, right, dandelions are quote unquote weeds, but even though dandelions are edible for a lot of us and also animals, why is it that we see it as an inferior species? So I think those are kind of like, the more in conceptual, more in depth. But I think that the other thing is that I don't see people with disabilities being able to roam around the park because sometimes they don't have access to a sidewalk that's actually movable. You don't have other resources for clean water, as an example, in some parks, or you see a lot of littering and trash in these environments. And so these are kind of like ways in which I think that what I'm trying to describe more is that how is it that we go to parks to connect, but we're only connecting with the very few people that we go with, but we don't see really much engagement of other communities talking to each other or learning from each other. These are things where I feel that as a kid growing up, festivals were something that I went to as a kid to learn and to really understand relationships of people. So that's kind of a more overview on that end.
I really appreciate that. And I know this is the perfect segue to bring in Pamela, because part of your love of the outdoors came from Los Angeles when you were a kid. And so I want to talk to Pamela about her work. I have your book right here, Pamela, The Unclaimed. Do you guys see this? Abandonment and Hope in the City of Angels. This book is so illuminating to me. You talk about up to 150,000 Americans. Did you guys hear that? 150,000 Americans now go unclaimed every year. In the New York Times, they talked about your book and they said social isolation is caused, of course, by eroding family ties, which is the kernel of maybe this particular problem that you've illuminated. So what is the tie between what you are highlighting in this book, these unclaimed bodies, and this epidemic of loneliness that we're in, but I'm sure didn't just start with this epidemic, which was only proclaimed an epidemic in 2023. So help us understand this tie.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Allison, and to Imagine, to having me on, to have this opportunity to talk. It's really a pleasure to be here. And events like this are so incredibly important for us to start to have some really difficult but necessary conversations to talk about how do we make spaces more equitable? How do we make them more welcoming? How do we create a more inclusive society? And so I'm really honored to be here. I think that, one thing I should just sort of back up and explain, who are the unclaimed and who am I writing about in this book? The unclaimed are people who, when they pass, they have no family willing or able to claim their bodies. And so this is a growing phenomenon across the United States. In our book, which I co-authored with a professor from UCLA, Stephen Timmermans, we really focus on what happens in Los Angeles because death is a very local event. And so, how each county organizes a response to the problem of not having family to claim the bodies is quite local. So we studied Los Angeles for many, many years. And I hope that Isaias and I can talk a little bit more about LA and what we've learned from these experiences of that particular city. But we looked at what happens when basically the county of Los Angeles steps in to fill the role of family. So if you die in America and you don't have a will and you haven't determined what will happen to your body after you pass, it falls on your legal next of kin. And I'm sure Isaias and Allison that you guys can also speak to this, but that doesn't always match who our legal next of kin is, doesn't always match how we live our lives. So we're finding that more and more Americans are building communities. They do have connection, but those connections may not be recognized by the law when it comes to who's allowed to claim. So that's one aspect, right? And the other is this notion of social isolation and loneliness. I'm a sociologist, so I've been trained to distinguish between the two, but I know in kind of, everyday discourse, we tend to use them interchangeably, but we're really looking at people for whom, you think of this kind of the urban myth of the loner, right? Living alone in their apartment, not maybe always getting out into nature, not having a lot of social ties. And that's absolutely true. There are many, many Americans who are kind of leading these very independent lives. And, the number of people in their social circle shrinks over time. So we write in the book about a man, David Spencer, who, as he approached his 60s and then into his 70s, his social world shrank such that he only had 3 people in his everyday life. And one of them was an ex-wife in another state. And so they talked on the phone. The other was a neighbor and the apartment manager of the complex that he lived in for many years. So when he passed, what we discovered is that he was estranged from his family of origin. Those are the people who have the legal task to claim the body. And so we find these stories over and over again in we write about 4 people in depth in the book, but we studied hundreds and hundreds of cases of individuals and many people like David. And then there's others like Lena who we write about. And, we Americans are taught to be independent, right? That you go it your own, you don't be a burden on other people. But actually, I think after working on this book, it's a beauty to be a burden on others. It's an opportunity, not just for connection, but really building bonds and ties so that you do have people there for you when you need them.
I would say that you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
And the literature, as you know, bears this out, that if you can ask for help, if you show vulnerability, then you actually can be more receptive to receiving it. Those who give feel better about themselves. The US Surgeon General, Dr. Murthy, describes that his sense of self-worth increases when you start giving back and helping, which of course helps to alleviate loneliness too. But there's another thing that I wanted to bring Isaias in for. And Isaias, you are what we call a climate influencer. You talk about eco-anxiety. There's one thing that you said, that too long our concerns about the environment have been about polar bears and saving wildlife, but we're not talking about the concerns of nature, perhaps in the less cute and cuddly and furry way, about the human way. And what's remarkable to me, if you follow Isaias, and of course everyone should, you are on Twitter, you're on Instagram, you're on Facebook, all of it is queer, brown, vegan. If you guys got that, queer, brown, vegan. You talk a lot about this and how people are feeling alien and isolated, not from the reasons perhaps that Pamela Prickett was just talking about in the Unclaimed, but now we're talking about these more existential threats. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, no, I love Pamela's thing because definitely it's all interconnected, right? From the isolation, loneliness to the climate crisis. I think from the environmental lens, it's important to kind of address straight off the fact that like nearly 56% of young people think humanity is doomed, which is related to loneliness, because I think that's something to talk about. But I think that one of the things that I really talk a lot about in my work is like how our dominant cultural system in America today very focuses on the humanizations of non-human logos. Is that there was a study done of this like exam, or not exam, it was like a teacher doing this exam. He showed 5 plant species on the left side and 5 brands, and he showed it to the kids, and he asked the kids to identify them. All the kids knew how to answer all the 5 brand logos. And it wasn't to say, oh, our generations care more about brands. It's the fact that, how we've really indoctrinated people to value a more non-human logo over a sacred living system. And so I think that's important to kind of, on our unpacking, is that I think now Americans have experienced some type of extreme weather event, whether you believe in the climate crisis or not. There's been extreme weather. Now, often at times, and this goes back to Pamela's point and what she was saying, especially people who end up, alone, is that in times of crisis, like flooding or heavy, fires that hit the West Coast or in the East Coast, people who are left behind are usually people who are elderly, people who are disabled, people who are single and don't have any family. So they are the ones who are often left as the victims of the crisis. And so I think it's important when we're trying to understand, like, okay, well, what does the environment have to do with loneliness? Is that, it's a death sentence for many people. And knowing the fact that America today, I think that, I'm writing my book proposal right now as we speak. I found this very cool factoid.
Wait, what? You're writing what right now? I
I'm
didn't
writing
hear
a
that.
book proposal, but I'm in the early stages.
What?
But I think that it's important to note that a lot of young people don't trust their neighbors today, and the most climate solution I always say is knowing your neighbor, because yes, 911 can help you, but your neighbor is the one that you trust the most. And a lot of young people, I think nearly half of them, don't trust their neighbors. So this kind of feeds on to this idea of like our social security nets of what older generations grew up on as like, yeah, like, of course I knew my neighbor, or like, oh, of course, like I'll give a ride to someone. Oh, of course, this is more of a community collective effort. Younger generations don't really have those as much of those strong relationships as we do. And the only places that we practice that a lot is in college. You see the examples of a walkable city. You see examples of like what it means to have healthcare, dental care, food, groceries, all walkable, right? No car needed. But then you get more into these different areas. It's so important to know that like in rural areas, they're already dispossessed from having resources available to them. So that makes their survivalhood for community really hard to find, and also to understand whether or not they can believe in themselves. And I think when people try to make fun of young people, like they're just complaining, it's like, I don't think it's complaining. It's more about we've lost a lot of places in which young people can go. Back in the 80s, 90s, people would use the malls, I guess, to hang out with their friends. Our generation didn't really, I mean, I kind of grew up with it, but I didn't really see it as a place to kind of connect with people. And of course, phones, the discussions around phones is another thing, but I think it's very important to understand, like, because we have disconnected a bit of ourselves of what it means to take care of a living system, a lot of us feel disempowered of like, well, how does it mean to really take care of our friends or our family or our loved ones? And that kind of adds into this factor of like, okay, well, if what happens if I don't care? And the long-term thing is loneliness.
It's interesting what you had talked about, that in crisis, there are certain populations that we can historically predict are left behind. There's a different type of abandonment that Pamela talks about in her book, The Unclaimed. And Pamela, you're a sociologist, you're an associate professor at the University of Amsterdam, coming back to California soon. I think you mentioned to me Pomona, right? In Pomona, California. So you bring a lot to bear to this conversation about abandonment. And to me, what was so interesting is that the New Republic ran a headline when it was talking about your book, The Unclaimed. It says, LA doesn't have a homelessness crisis. It's a crisis of abandonment. And that is what is fueling all of these unclaimed bodies. And so maybe we can talk about that as an extension of what Isaias was just talking about.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Isaias I'm so grateful to bringing attention to the kind of generational differences that we're finding in America, right? So when we talk about loneliness, we have to think about how things are different for younger generations, Gen Z, millennials, versus older generations. I definitely grew up going to the mall and the roller skating rink, so I'm just aging myself there. But one thing that I think we found in the course of the book that surprised me, that I think is going to be an even bigger issue for younger generations, for Isaiah's generation, is that about connections with family and parents in particular. So Allison, I know that you've written extensively on parentless parents, right? And so the particular kind of changes to the life course, how that changes your view on life. We ended up studying people who are parentless in many ways and through estrangement. Or childless now through estrangement, or siblingless, like they've lost ties, right? And I think, there's just beginning to start to be some sociological research on how estrangement kind of patterns out by different populations. But I do think that younger people, the distrust of neighbors, but also more opportunity for conflict with the families of origin. And a lot of this has to do with really important issues that Isaias brought up earlier in the program of, recognition and identification. And also, some people propose that the idea of social media has made it easier, as they say, cut them out, right? There's all this language about toxicity and cut out all the toxic people. Well, what does that mean when it's your family? And are we thinking about the long-term consequences when we cut people out who are family? And I'm not here to say to people that you shouldn't cut ties when they're unhealthy and there's abuse. Of course, I'm personally implicated in this process. I write about my personal experience in the book. So there's no judgment there. I'm just saying that I'm not sure I'm hearing the conversation enough, except in places like Reimagine, where we're thinking, okay, so what are we going to do if this is how things are changing? And so it's like, to go back to the question of abandonment, I'm thinking about, the obligations that we have to each other, the obligations of, and what the role is of government and policy in helping with that, right? So the Surgeon General has argued that we need to foster connection, which would aid in preventing abandonment. I fully concur with that. I think at the same time, it can't all just be government. We can't count on government to solve the problem of how we are more likely to abandon one another, or just maybe ignore the problems, all the problems that we write about and that Isaias has been writing about.
This is perfect, because what I want to do for the next 9 minutes or so before we bring in questions is to set the stage for these next few moments. I want to talk about the future. I want to talk about, we've identified some of the problems. Now let's turn and shift and think about some of the change that is needed, change that is already underway, the positive things that we can then look forward to that maybe is on the horizon, which I would love to make sure that we're getting to. If you guys have questions, please pop them in the chat. What's going to happen is that Andy, who you met at the very beginning of our time today, he's going to go through the chat. He's going to extract the questions for Isaias and Pamela that he thinks are the most applicable to the most people, and make sure we answer those questions. And so take advantage of this time. You are here for a reason. It's rare to get Isaias and Pamela Prickett together under one roof, so to speak. And so don't squander this moment. Don't kick yourself at the strike of 2 o'clock Eastern and say, oh, I wish I could have asked my question. Do it now, put it in the chat, and then Andy will get to it. Pamela, we talked about how in your book, The Unclaimed, you identify some of these real, really heartbreaking stories, these 4 stories, but you also talk about really what's exceptional. And I think what's exciting now is that strangers coming together to honor other strangers, we in life, but in honoring them in depth. I think this is happening in Boyle Heights, a part of LA, you had said. And then here's what Kate Bowler had said. It's a blurb for your book. We reaffirm our humanity each time we tell the stories of those already gone. So help me understand, help us all understand what's going on now that we can forge connections with each other in life as we honor those who have died. I think it's remarkable that we can form connections at funerals and cemeteries. What's going on in LA that you found?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for the question, Allison, because this is the other major part of the book, right? So we talk about the problem, but we're also talking about what people are doing to show up to deal with this. And so what makes Los Angeles unique in many ways in the United States is that every year there is an annual ceremony for the unclaimed. It's organized by a group of chaplains at the county hospital. They come together, they organize this beautiful 35-minute multi-language interfaith ceremony. And before the pandemic, it was up to hundreds of people coming to the cemetery on a Wednesday or Thursday morning, taking time off from work in order to show up to honor the unclaimed. And so these are strangers who don't know the people that they're honoring and burying that day, but they know they're human beings, they're residents of their city, and they deserve some humanity. They deserve dignity. And I think, I remember the first time I went in 2015, soon after learning about this ceremony. And I mean, I was like many other people, I'm teared up because I just thought to myself, when else in Los Angeles, I've been there for 10 years, when else have I come together with people, so many people from so many walks of life, people I never met, never knew, and we're having the same similar emotional experience. And so sociologists argue those kinds of moments of ritual are an opportunity to repair our divisions, and also expand our notion of what community is and what family is, right? So people stand up that day and they say, maybe the legal family isn't there, but we will be their family today. And that's really beautiful. And we really try to use that and also other work that folks are doing to draw attention to the fact that maybe we could think about burial being much more of a community event than we have been inclined to do for quite some time.
If you want to learn more from Pamela, not only can you read her new book, The Unclaimed, but on X, you can follow Pamela at Pamela J. Prickett. Do not forget the J. You will not find her. Pamela J. Prickett. We've already, of course, mentioned that you can follow Isaias across social media platforms at Queer Brown Vegan. I want to talk to you, Isaias. You've talked so beautifully in other venues about the siloization of our society. What Pamela was just talking about is that, silo or not, people are coming together when it's so crucial in finding community in the most odd space, the most wonderful space, the most unexpected space, a cemetery. And I'm wondering what you see as being the porous nature of those silos. Where are you seeing the cracks? Where are we coming together in spaces that we may not assume we are?
Yeah, I really love this. And I wanted to kind of echo from Pamela's, like, I recently, I've had experience of what the concept of death or what that looks like for a lot of people. And there's a model, it was founded by researchers or psychologists, I believe. It's called the Death Cafe, and so it's like interactive space where people come together to discuss either the concept of death or understanding what death looks like. And it was interesting because when I hosted it, we weren't talking about the fear of the future of the planet dying, but it was more about people's relationship of, I don't feel I feel like inside I'm dying because I don't like my career. Inside I'm dying because I grieve for a child that I lost, or, different really stories from different people. And I think that that was really beautiful because a lot of the people were not environmentalists. A lot of people were like, I just found this online and saw it online and someone shared it, and I don't have any space to talk about it. I can't afford therapy, and I don't expect this to be therapy. I just expected a place where I can just feel seen and not do that. And I think that like these types of groups have always existed for like decades, and I feel that for younger generations, we can sometimes see that as a very hard thing to do because we've been so kind of grown up to be cautious of a lot of people. And in today's era, there's a lot of valid reasons why we should be cautious because of exploitation, of abuse, and other things have happened. But the other thing I like to say is like, I think that when it comes to like democracy, for example, and finding bipartisan discussions, I was someone growing up as a young person that probably would not put myself with people with different centrist or conservative views. And now being able to be invited to talk to them, I think that, not talking about politics first, but talking about their story to understand their beliefs has opened up a new, not opportunity to, guide them to the right way, but maybe talk about our differences while also understanding what are things that we can commonly agree on, such as, we agree that life should continue to exist and that we need more environmental policies to protect the outdoors, or we need more resources going into citizens and those who are also undocumented. Like those are my personal things that I really wish for. So I think that my mentor, her name's Ellen Kelsey, she talks about this word called like evidence-based hope, to basically not think about hope as this wishful thinking, but actually looking at the continued progress and momentum of things that are happening. And she basically argues that that's the thing with hope, is that it cannot be seen by people at times, and that helps me reframe the ways of how I see ecological landscapes of like species coming back, and like these are experts in different industries really working together. And I think models like the Death Cafe or Climate Cafe models that are coming up in grassroots, young people are doing them. I feel like that's really opening up a pathway for intergenerational mentorship, but also intergenerational wisdom, where I feel that a lot of my friends today are older and they really have guided me to think about a lot of things in my 20s now, which I don't think that people my age would give me the best advice either, because we're just trying to figure out. So I think that there's this new opening where young people are feeling more welcome to ask critical questions, but to ask them in a way that's also safe for them to explore that.
I think one of the important lessons that I have learned so much from Dr. Ruth in writing this book with her that's coming out in October, that's called The Joy of Connections, is the real power of agency. So if there is estrangement, perhaps not accepting it if it's wise to do so, and going out of your way to try, if it's possible, it may not be in all cases, to make amends, to not just accept the way things are, but to push and agitate for the way you want them to be. So I am learning a lot. Dr. Ruth is 95. She'll be 96 when this book comes out. So when you talk about the power of I'll show you the cover. This just off the press. The Joy of Connections. Yay! When you talk about learning and being smarter from talking to people who are not in your generation, I feel like that is the wisdom that we are learning, or I'm learning writing this book with her. Andy, I want to bring you back into our conversation. I know you've been paying very close attention to the chat. As you come back in, I want to remind people that one way you can have agency and forge new connections is to not just be done and turn off your Zoom at the strike of the hour. What you can choose to do is continue this conversation. Pamela Prickett is at Pamela J. Prickett on X. I'm at A. Gilbert Writer on all platforms. I can use the followers, come along. We have Isaias, who is on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at Queer Brown Vegan. And by the way, I should mention, of course, Pamela and Isaias both have websites. Pamela's is pamelaprickett.com. You can learn more about the Unclaimed there and her other work. And Isaias, you're at queerbrownvegan.com. So it's up to you guys. Turn off your camera at the strike of the 2 o'clock hour, or continue the conversation and be connected with all of us. I hope you choose to be connected. Andy, let's go to the questions.
I saw a really important question from Lauren. How much of claiming versus abandonment is economic? Funerals, burials, and cremations are expensive. Is this more about reluctance to assume financial responsibilities than lack of social connections, or both? And there was sort of a follow-up question to that about how other countries handle these issues.
Okay, great questions. So we deal with this at length towards the end of the book, after we've kind of taken you through the stories. And so I kind of recap a little bit of that, what's in the epilogue. I came into this, so my research before I did The Unclaimed was to study a mosque in South Central Los Angeles. And my areas of study were religion and inequality or poverty and neighborhoods. So I was really looking at, what community does to sort of help people as they're facing difficult socioeconomic positions. And that's how I came into this topic, in fact, through somebody who was in that mosque community that was at risk of going unclaimed. And what I found there is that members of the community were really opposed to cremation, which is what happens. And this was for religious reasons. That's what happens to somebody who goes unclaimed. So the member who was at risk of going unclaimed, they rallied, they held a fundraiser, they went and got legal representation in order to get the right to claim her. So this is the story of chosen family stepping up to claim. And so I came into this project thinking, oh, it's going to be much more a story about poverty or funeral poverty. And I wish I could tell you that's what I found. I really do, because then I feel like it would be an easier problem to solve. The truth is that money was one important factor, but it wasn't the biggest factor. It really was estrangement. And it makes a lot of sense that if the county calls you, and let's say you have an Uncle Joe who you haven't spoken to in a decade or more, and the county calls you and says, well, you're the legal next of kin, it's your legal responsibility, your duty to do this. At that point, $8,000, which is about the average cost of a funeral, that's, yeah, I mean, it doesn't make sense maybe in that context, right, for you. And it is expensive. And Jessica Mitford, showed this in the 1960s. It's been expensive for a very long time, but overwhelmingly the data points to estrangement and social erosion of ties. And also the law not recognizing what I talked about earlier about who might be the right person to claim is not always the legal person designated with the task. So I want to argue that going forward in America, one of the things we need to be doing is expanding notions of kinship and family to include more people. And some federal policy is starting to do that, but it's really, we're lagging to the times. I mean, most of us don't live in what's considered a standard family anymore. So the law, and policies need to catch up for that. And that is surprisingly pretty common in other parts of the world as well. I know we have this image of many places in Europe as being much more open to, and they do have more open and inclusive policies, but you also find rises in people going unclaimed in the UK, in the Netherlands, in Germany, as well as in Asia. I mean, South Korea and the place that has dealt with this the most in public conversation is Japan. And in Japan, what they've done is they've used the unclaimed as really a kind of mirror to reflect back on what's happening with society. And they're finding that it is changing notions of what do we owe each other, and the loss of or the decline of multi-generational households, right? So this is an international concern, poverty and economics obviously are incredibly important, and I don't want to downplay that. But we saw situations where people could have had the funeral paid for and they still didn't show up. It was strangers who showed up in those cases sometimes. So that would
That
be
was a
my
great question. And thank you, Pamela, for such a thoughtful response. Andy, back to you. Thank you.
I'm just curious, Isaias, if you have more reflections on this topic of chosen family, or I like how queer writer Armistead Maupin describes his logical family as opposed to his biological family.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, collective, I mean, humans have grown up as collectivist cultures. There's never been such a thing of like a single, I mean, there are very rare cases maybe of people growing up, but we come from a collectivist society. I think one of those introductions I always speak about is that when I went to Berkeley, I lived in a cooperative house that was 140 people. It was a former hotel that got renovated into a big house. And in that cooperative house, that's where I learned about how do communes, I guess, operate. It wasn't really a commune, it was obviously a certified by the university, but it was this way of like sustainable living that allowed us to really have different roles. And like there was the manager, there was the council lead, and obviously it wasn't like there are like parents, but it was very good to see this like structural community that was based on that. And throughout that, I remember for a lot of people with either disabilities who are queer and trans, who are marginalized, that end up seeking a lot of spaces in respective identity spaces, they often find their chosen families. And I think that's a beautiful thing where, I think that in my mind, the nuclear family models had tried to install this vision of like a binary set view of like, this is your mom, this is your dad, and these are your siblings, or you're just yourself, like, and this is your parents. But I think that like, for decades, and I think this is true for many immigrant kids, is that my godmother acted as my grandma. Even though she wasn't blood related to me, she took care of my siblings and I when my parents had to work. And I saw her as my grandma, even though it was my godmother. And I feel like in different cultures, it's always different people taking care of the kids. Like it's not so much like the parent was always the one taking care, which majority of the time it is true, but it's the siblings, it's the cousins, it's the aunts, it's the uncles. Like you really, and it's true where that statement comes from. It's like you need a village to raise a family, or you need a village to raise yourself and to nurture yourself. And I feel like for older adults, I was talking to friends about how we want to buy property together because in America's economy, we can't afford a home anymore. So can we invest in a home together and make it and renovate it? These are kind of examples where I feel like, chosen family is really key as a solution for a lot of people to prevent, not to prevent, but to hopefully avoid the loneliness, or to avoid the person being isolated from society. I think that it is really hard today in today's economy to find those communities. But I also know that they exist, and they've continued to exist for decades, like churches, shelters. They're all community homes too. I think that sometimes people see them as like, oh, those are places where you don't want to go, but those are actually sanctuaries for a lot of people. And that's where I really feel that it's important for each and every one person to find that sanctuary that they find at home.
I would like to just add one thing, if we don't mind. I saw in the chat that there may be some thirst for some concrete, actionable strategies. And one thing comes to mind, and Dr. Ruth is on the brain because our edits are actually due tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. to our book that's coming out in October. But one thing that I find remarkable about her that maybe you guys don't know is that she was an orphan at 10 years old. So she grew up in Germany, and then during the Holocaust, her mother and grandmother put her on a train to leave the country to escape the Nazis. And that was it. She's an only child. And so she grew up as an orphan in an orphanage, as a refugee, and what she would say about coming together and about feeling whole, that she belongs, is about how she, stitch by stitch, friend by friend, assembled on purpose, with choice and deliberateness, her chosen family, her own family by choice. That is how she got through life. And so that is something that is within all of our power to do. If we have suffered a loss, if we are estranged, whatever the reason, that we can then make that choice to surround ourselves with people who begin to make us feel more whole. But what she will also say is and this is very hard to hear, it's like tough medicine, is stop complaining and do something about it. So that's hard sometimes when you're in pain. And it may be that you're not ready to take the reins today. But if you know that your future is up to you and what you do with your decisions today and how that impacts your tomorrow, that you will get there and you will make the choices that'll make you feel less alone. But that choice, she would say, is up to you. And maybe we can talk just for a couple of moments about personal agency and choices and not leaving it up to others to solve this very intimate challenge. Pamela, what do you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, this is the million-dollar question that we all want answers to. And I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. And I hope you forgive me, I'm a sociologist, so I'm much more comfortable giving you structural solutions because I'm trained to talk about structural problems. But if I come at it from the perspective of the unclaimed, but also as an urban sociologist. So I've been teaching urban sociology for many years to students in college. And one of my objectives when I'm teaching is to not just get them to learn the theories, but to think about how to be a better neighbor, how to be a better citizen. And, you know, thinking about we've got to build neighborhoods again, quite honestly. So I think it's really local. I think it works like, you know, you can find the death cafes if you want to talk about, you know, if you have grief and you want to find somebody to talk to. You can certainly go to an unclaimed ceremony and know that you're kind of surrounded by other like-minded people, right? That you may have many differences, but in this you share regard. But on a day-to-day basis, I do think it's really important to focus on cultivating local ties, right? In a city, I think about a place like Los Angeles, where, you know, if you have people, you know, across the city, I would live there and I had friends in other parts of town, and then just knowing traffic, it was so easy for me and for them to just kind of flake on plans because I didn't want to sit in traffic. But if you're really, you know, so they're important to have, but I'm also really focused in my next move on building local ties, getting to know my neighbors, knocking on the door. Hi, I'm Pamela. I want to get to know you. Dropping a note to just say who you are. And I think this is something that we, you know, some of us grew up being told is what you do. And then we just all kind of stopped doing it. We have this intense fear of the stranger, right? And I think we do have to sort of let go of that a little bit and be willing to take a risk to introduce ourselves.
It is about taking a risk, right? Yeah. It's about being vulnerable and putting yourself out there. Isaias, I would love you to chime in this regard about the personal agency to make a difference in your own life when it comes to loneliness.
Yeah, I agree so much with Pamela, with everything you're saying. I think, you know, solutions on that is something that's always on the forefront. And of course, you know, I keep in mind about my abilities, my privilege and everything that I have access to on my end. So I think that for me, what's always kept me grounded is always looking at history, like referencing the resistance of movements that have always happened to create a regenerative just world. And I feel that the second thing that's more like actionable, like local, is like, how do we really, how do we continue to nurture the existing relationships we have, right? I was talking to a friend. My friend was like, when's the last time a friend offered you, a drive to the airport, or like small acts of kindness, like that? It's not so much like you owe me. It's more like, of course I'll do that. Or going with a friend to go on a walk, doing things that are outside of like, I tell my friends that don't like foraging if they want to go foraging with me, and like half the time they enjoy it so much because they get to really slow down and think about other things in life, and we just get to look at really cool species. I think that even within the existing time constraints around time poverty, where everyone's like, I don't have enough time to even cook for myself, potlucks have been really cool things that me and my friends do once a month. We do it at each other's places, and we bring either a dish that we make, and it's honestly so wholesome, because I think that like, I didn't realize how much I missed the communal moments of eating together. And I feel like those are things where it's like, we're not putting a like $1,000 potluck dinner. It's like a $20-$30 budget per person, and see what you can make with the groceries that you can get. And I feel like those are moments where our solutions to get people to realize that they're not alone, and also inviting their own friends in different groups and having those larger social networks.
I'm going to say thank you for ending our conversation on such a practical note. I think sometimes people get into a rut where they feel like they're doing all the inviting, and maybe they get resentful that they're not being invited to somebody else's place, and so then they stop being social altogether. The idea of a potluck, it may seem so obvious, but it removes the pressure from the host. And it's just a way of maybe making something that's social a bit more democratic, a bit more accessible. And so I love that point. I want to say before I pass it on to Andy, Isaias, thank you. You are a climate influencer, you are an educator, you are a light, and everyone should keep in touch with you at Queer Brown Vegan across social media. Pamela, I loved your book, The Unclaimed. I thought it was riveting. I thought the 4 examples that you chose were brilliant. Another day of how you found these stories I would love to talk with you about. And you can follow Pamela. You're on X at Pamela J. Prickett. I am so grateful. Andy, back to you, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Allison, and thank you, Pamela, and thank you, Isaias. It's great to have you back with Reimagine. I want to respond to GJ's comment. He would like to see more of this series, and Allison and Reimagine are just starting the discussion of extending this series. We will try to revive it in the fall, and it's timed very well because that's when Allison's book will be published. So keep your eyes out, and for sure, register for our next session in June. On June 20th, Allison will be in conversation with 2 additional very special guests like these 2. We have best-selling author and Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Anna Quinlan, and we have Dr. Tasha Golden, who serves as Director of Research at the International Arts and Mind Lab at Johns Hopkins. There is finally some scientific data that folks experiencing loneliness can improve their mental health and well-being with arts and nature. Of course, this is something that just seems obvious to a lot of us, but there's actually evidence now in research. So we're going to learn about that. And we're going to learn about this new trend in medicine called social prescription. Medical providers are beginning to dose not only antidepressants to people, but also scripts to attend writing workshops, to visit museums, to take a stroll in your garden. And there are health insurance companies piloting the idea of paying for this. So I think it's going to be really interesting. So please register for that. And thank you all again. And we hope to see you on June 20th. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.